So it gives me great pleasure to introduce two esteemed speakers today. Dhivan is an ordained member of the Triratna Buddhist Order. He's written widely about a wide range of subjects. He also lectures in Western philosophy and has a strong interest, I think, in Buddhist Modernism and in ecology, which I'm hoping that will be brought in today. Stephen Batchelor. Stephen is a well-known author and commentator on the Dharma, also bringing, I think it's a unique view on some aspects of Buddhism in the West, and a presentation in the Dharma that is always challenging, radical, refreshing, and yeah, it's a great pleasure to see them both on today, and I'll bow out.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. So I had some email contact with Stephen, and we agreed that we might discuss different interpretations of early Buddhism, or perhaps even where we disagree. But I wonder if I can start our conversation, Stephen, by reading something out from your latest book, The Art of Solitude. So here it is. I finished it in the bath last night. Towards the end, you write about a ayahuasca ritual in 2017 in Andalusia, and at the conclusion of that, you write, "As Mother Ayahuasca takes me in her arms, I realized that last night I vomited up my attachment to Buddhism. In passing out, I died. In coming to, I was, so to speak, reborn. I no longer have to fight these battles, I repeat to myself. I am no longer a combatant in the Dharma wars. It feels as if the course of my life has shifted onto another vector, like a train shunted off its familiar track onto a new trajectory." So you're right, I vomited up my attachment to Buddhism. And that really struck me. And it raises the question of, over the years, people have asked you, are you a Buddhist? Is it perhaps not a question anymore?
Well, it's a question, obviously, and as someone who spent my whole adult life doing nothing but study, practice, teach, write about Buddhism, it's an entirely legitimate question to ask. Are you a Buddhist? And in some ways, I must admit, I have no difficulty thinking of myself as a practitioner of the Dharma. But do I really want to identify with Buddhism? I'm not so sure. I have a battle with Buddhism, as came out very clearly in the passage you read. I called it the Dharma Wars. And I feel that, for much of my adult life, really, I've been struggling to somehow come to terms with the Dharma. And over the course of time, what really matters for me is the practice of the Dharma. And more, I feel uncomfortable with the label Buddhist or Buddhism. And I also notice how Buddhism, I think, can get in the way of practicing the Dharma. That's a phrase that comes to my mind a lot at the moment. Buddhism can actually, because of certain beliefs you're expected to hold, because of certain deferences to certain authorities, because of all range of things, because of being a Buddhist, I might actually be struggling with questions that are really peripheral to the practice of the Dharma. And again, we have to acknowledge that Buddhism is a world religion, whether I like it or not, that's what it is. But the Dharma is not. The Dharma is not a world religion. And the Buddha taught the Dharma. He didn't teach a world religion, became that. So yeah, this is, the experience I describe in the book was certainly a sort of a cathartic moment, obviously triggered by the ceremonial context, the ingestion of a psychotropic medicine, ayahuasca. And so it was a very, very highly specific occasion. And I think on such occasions, you sometimes perhaps oversimplify and somehow make the point very, very clearly, but perhaps not sufficiently acknowledging an aura of ambiguity that may still float around it. So yeah, I do still fight the Dharma wars a bit, but I do also sense that since those experiences I describe in this book, I have parted company with Buddhism. I don't feel I have to justify what I say by being able to cite some text in the Pali Canon, which for a long time was a kind of knee-jerk form of how I behaved. Though actually, the text you read out was slightly modified from what the actual experience was. When I came out of that experience, I didn't think I vomited up my attachment to Buddhism. I said to myself, I vomited up Buddhism. That's what it felt like, viscerally, that somehow I'd, for a period of time at least, I had shed something, which I could loosely call Buddhism, as recognizing how it had somehow been both, an enormous help in my life, obviously, but at the same time can become a hindrance, can become a problem. That I get preoccupied with issues around Buddhism and kind of lose sight of the Dharma, lose sight of why I want to practice in the first place, because I'm struggling about, ultimate and relative truth or something like that, you see. All my energy and my frustration gets channeled into that discussion. And as a consequence, I could easily lose the plot.
I guess that's a theme for most of us Dharma practitioners, that that there has to be a way into learning the Dharma, and that is usually by means of some tradition or other. So I'm a member of the Triratna Buddhist Order. We're now quite a big order. We've got an ordination training program, and behind that there's a Mitra study program, and it's not just a matter of learning the Dharma. There's a kind of context in which one absorbs the Dharma, which can sometimes feel like peer pressure to take on a certain sort of mode of considering what Dharma is, what Dharma isn't, and this is what therefore is what the Triratna Buddhist order and community stands for, and so on. And then there's a tension between one's own process and the tradition, even in which that one practices. So I wonder if this kind of Dharma Buddhism kind of tension is one that is bound to occur in the life of any authentic Dharma practitioner.
Probably, yeah. I suspect so. I mean, I'm always aware of the paradox, I suppose. I wouldn't be able to have done all the work that I've done. I wouldn't be here speaking to you now had I not spent 10 years of my life, all through my 20s, as a Buddhist monk, training in very conservative traditions. I wasn't tempted to go and join Sangha in London. I wanted to get back to the source. I went off to India and I worked with these old Tibetan lamas and I learned Tibetan. Then I went to a Zen monastery and worked with an old Korean Zen master. And these were not traditions that had any interest at all in adapting themselves to modernity or to doing the sort of work that I'm interested in now. I was very conscious of being able to work within a very conservative tradition. I'm also profoundly aware that had it not been for the existence of these institutions, the things I often rail against, dogmatic and hierarchical and so on, if these institutions had not survived in the forms of monasteries in Central Asia, in East Asia, in India, had generations of men and women not dedicated their lives just to memorizing texts, that would have been all they would have done for many people for centuries, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now. So in other words, I'm indebted to the institutions of Buddhism for having, I think almost miraculously in some occasions, kept this continuum, this lineage, this tradition going. It never ceases to amaze me. And I am very conscious of being a beneficiary of all of these people's sacrifices and work. And all of the things that I perhaps don't personally like very much about Buddhism, they nonetheless have constituted the vehicle whereby this tradition, the Dharma, has come down to us today. But there is, as you suggest, I think an unavoidable tension between the two. And I think Buddhist traditions themselves are conscious of this. I mean, you have the tension in the early, let's say, the Theravada tradition between the city monks and the forest monks. Mm-hmm. It's the tension between people who are much more committed to upholding a orthodoxy and a dogma and training programs and monastic situations and so on, as opposed to those who say, no, let's go back to the practice, let's go sit under the tree in the forest and drop all that stuff and just get down to nuts and bolts. You see the same in Zen. Zen Buddhism is essentially a rebellion against Buddhism, against the orthodoxies of its time. You look at a figure like Naropa, great scholar at Nalanda University in India, who then suddenly sort of throws it all away, runs off and becomes a tantric yogin, a Mahasiddha of some kind. And all of those instances, I think, acknowledge how Buddhism and the Dharma are perhaps necessarily in conflict to some degree. Maybe that's simply part of our fate, part of our karma in working within this tradition.
I wonder if talk of Buddhist traditions in relation to the individual naturally brings up this, the topic of what some of us talk about in terms of Buddhist modernism.
Yeah.
Like all of us practicing the Dharma in the present age are by necessity having to engage with a development and adaptation of the kinds of Buddhist traditions which, as you say, we're indebted to for passing on the Dharma. And yet those traditions belong to a pre-modern world. The Dharma practitioners and those traditions would believe in Mount Meru as the center of the world, as the universe, that we're all continuously reborn in various realms, not even natural realms, God realms and hell realms and so on. There's a whole worldview which is quite at odds with the discoveries of modern science. And yet the Dharma still offers some kind of existential message to us, which we can put into practice. Therefore, there's this struggle to develop a modern form of Buddhism. I think in Triratna, our founder, Sangha kind of went through a process of adaptation back in the 60s. So I think for that reason, order members in our Triratna Buddhist order and participants, in some ways, the Buddhism we encounter is already a modernized phenomenon, and we don't necessarily experience this tension in the same way. So we feel okay with saying I'm a Buddhist, but what we mean by Buddhism, of course, is this modernist reinterpretation of the Dharma that Sangha and others have made. Whereas for yourself, it was Buddhism was a pre-modern tradition to start with.
This is it's a very complex subject. In many ways, I find I've been recently looking. Funnily enough, I've been reading Gampopa, who's a Tibetan 11th century Tibetan scholar, and it reminded me of this distinction, Mahayana tradition particularly makes between the Shravakas, the Pacceka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. And in other words, the listeners, the people who are devoted to a teacher community. The Pacceka Buddhas really mean solitaries, people who kind of figure things out pretty much for themselves. And Bodhisattvas are those whose practice is so much motivated by their concern for others and their love and their care for the world. And I wonder if in some ways Buddhist modernism might learn something from that distinction. I wonder if in fact the time of the Pacceka Buddha may have come in some ways. The idea that the Dharma in modernity may not repeat the historical pattern of constructing institutions and orthodoxies and so forth and so on, but would actually be a much freer, a much more sort of fluid network of relationships and friendships and connections that would encourage the individual person to, in a sense, flourish in their own lights, to become authentically who they can become. Sangharakshita, for example, speaks about the individual quite centrally in his writings. And that's, I've always been struck by that, because I do wonder whether we may have to question the kinds of traditions and modes and forms that Buddhism has embodied itself in historically. And as we encounter modernity, we're not just encountering a human society with a few different features. I think we're actually encountering a radically different way in which human beings relate to one another. I mean, the whole issue of secularism, for example, is one that Buddhism has never even conceptualized in the past. The fact or even the idea of religion, actually, if we're really honest. I mean, I think these are Western categories. But I do feel that by going back to some of the early texts too, the idea of the Buddha about stream entry, where he says, you know, the person whose Dharma eye has opened, who's become a stream entrant, has become independent of others in their practice, become aparapacchaya, not dependent on others anymore, which to me flags, again, this idea of community training, you know, formal training within a Buddhist tradition should prepare you in some ways to find your own wings, to become your own, to find your own voice, to go your own way, to not be, in a sense, constrained by the demands and rules and beliefs of a particular community. And I think you find that in Sangharakshita's writings too. But the problem is the problem I call the bricks and mortar problem. In other words, it's all very well to encourage everybody to become their own teacher and go off and do their own thing, but then who's going to train all these? Who's going to run the training programs? Who's going to keep the buildings intact? Who's going to pay the rent? Who's going to have the systems in place, whatever form they might take, whether virtual or physical, that actually enable an environment whereby people can find their own wings and their own voice and so forth and so on. That's the dilemma, again, in a much more pragmatic sense, I feel. So in some ways, I feel that we'll always probably, at least as far as I can imagine, you know, we'll have the presence of Buddhist or Buddhistic type institutions that will provide some service, but rather than them becoming the goal or the end of the whole business. And that's the problem I found in Buddhist monasteries, is that once the monastery gets to be a certain size, then the role of the monks is very often keeping the monastery afloat, making sure that it survives. And so you kind of get a weird inversion from a devotion to the Dharma to the need to be able to, you know, fix the monastery roof. So the bricks and mortar problem. Ironically, what we're doing now through Zoom is getting rid of a lot of the bricks and the mortar problems. Right? People are saying, actually, we don't really need to go to these buildings. We can have much the same experience online. So I don't know whether this kind of new technologies will perhaps also create a new virtual environment for Sangha building and training and so forth. Maybe they will. I don't know where the future's going, obviously.
When I heard that you were planning to come to the Buddhafield Festival, Stephen, I was really looking forward to perhaps showing you around the fields of the actual festival. Zoom is very good, but the experience of the Buddhafield Festival is one that perhaps speaks a bit to kind of situation you just described. Far from being bricks and mortar, it's this extremely temporary kind of happening in a number of fields, which kind of participates in a deep truth about that we're all visitors to this earth. And in the case of Buddhafield, we pitch up in a light way in this beautiful part of Somerset,
Mm-hmm.
and we live together
Mm-hmm.
for those days. It's a very intense, a communal experience with all sorts of different people doing their own thing,
Mm-hmm.
and we get the chance to sort of interact and learn about different ways people make sense of this human existence,
Mm-hmm.
kind of centered on you could say the Dharma as a living tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another aspect perhaps of Buddhist modernism, at least in Triratna, is that we're reinventing Sangha to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
we're interpreting Sangha rather than being the Sangha of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, or even the fourfold assembly of monks and nuns and lay people. Sangha is a new ideal of how human beings learn to communicate as individuals, but finding common values and perhaps common practices. So I see that as part of our Triratna sort of reinterpretation of Buddhism.
And I've always admired that in the Triratna, the emphasis on Sangha, and also this attempt to somehow break free of the binary between the monk and the layperson, the expert and the dilettante, as it were. On the other hand, I also feel that Triratna is preserving some of those structures. I mean, order members and so forth and so on. I mean, I can see the point of all that, but it's not something that really attracts me greatly, to be quite honest. I don't know, maybe I just had too much of monastic living that I don't particularly hold it, I'm not so attracted to it anymore. But I agree with you. I think the key is nothing to do with the outer lifestyles that a monk might have or a layperson might have. And I think that is a very detrimental distinction to make. And I think also translating upasika as layperson immediately somehow downgrades that person. They're amateurs. They're not doing the real thing. And so there's a whole play of authority that's built into that particular dichotomy. And I think it's way past its sell-by date. I have little time for it. I can no longer think of the bhikkhu, the ordained monk, as somehow an ideal model for a practice of the Dharma in today's world. In fact, I think it's a rather unideal model. It might suit certain people, or might suit certain people for certain parts of their life. I've benefited from monastic training, but to think that then has to be the kind of ideal to which you would aspire. And in many Buddhist groups, not in Triratna, but in others, you often hear, well, if you really want to practice, you should become a monk or a nun, as though that's really the only serious option open to you. And I feel that all of that discussion about whether there should be fully ordained nuns and all of that stuff is really rather missing the far more important point that you raise, namely, what is the nature of the community that we're trying to create? What does Sangha mean? In the sense of Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha, which has got nothing whatsoever to do with Bhikkhu Sangha, Bhikkhuni Sangha, or fourfold assemblies or anything like that. The Arya Sangha is what really matters. And I think that's probably what you're meaning by Sangha. It's the community of those who are ennobled by the Dharma. That is what truly matters. And Buddhist tradition acknowledges that too, that is the real Sangha. It's those whose lives have been transformed in such a way that they now are living from that dharmic perspective in their lives. And such a Sangha is not held together by any outward form or structure. It's held together by effectively shared concerns. That's what holds us together. We have the same fundamental core values organized in a particular matrix that's recognizably dharmic. And the core, of course, again, as Sangharakshita has pointed out very well, is the triple refuge, is the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, which again has got nothing to do with monks or nuns or anything like that. But those are the three primary commitments around which you then seek to transform your life. And any community that is founded on those commitments and values would be a potential, real, live, interactive, learning body. And the other thing I feel is important with Sangha, this is something I learned from Martin Buber, is to make a distinction between a community and a collective. And a collective for Buber was basically a group of people who all believe in exactly the same thing and all behave in exactly the same way. And anybody who steps out of line, has a heretical thought or whatever, be it political or religious, is then booted out. A collective, therefore, characterizes lots of religions, traditional religions, political parties, where the individual's particular uniqueness has to be suppressed in order to maintain a sense of conformity, a sense of working within the same organization for the same ends. And one of the things that distressed me greatly when I left the Tibetan community of which I was a part and went to Korea is that many of my friends, my Dharma friends, basically were not interested in me anymore. I'd somehow betrayed them, gone off to, the dreadful Zen school. And then I realized that how relatively few of my friends were, in a sense, true friends, not friends because we happen to believe the same things and operate in the same Buddhist framework. So Sangha has to somehow go beyond sectarian differences. It has to go beyond holding the same orthodox views. It has to go beyond doing the same practices. We need to find a deeper commonality of value and purpose that then could actually, I feel, give birth to a form of Sangha that may not really have configured itself in Buddhist history so far.
I think in Triratna we have quite a sense of the project being an experiment, following on from your thoughts, that none of us are sure if it's going to work to try and reinvent a Buddhist tradition like this and develop a living community of Dharma practitioners with these kinds of conditions. But what better thing to do than to engage with an experiment like this?
No, that's right. I think we have to recognize that at our particular phase in Buddhist history, we're in a transitional moment. We're moving from one set of cultures that have often remained unchanged for centuries into modernity, which is a global phenomenon, and a global phenomenon that is highly secularized. And so necessarily our generation, maybe several generations, will be in a way working this out as we go along. We'll be figuring this out through our own experiments, as you quite rightly put it. And I think we have to think of our practice in more general terms as an experiment. I like to think of my own life as a kind of work in progress, my practice of the Dharma as a work in progress. And I think that sort of vision also attunes very well with the notions of impermanence, of unsatisfactoriness, of contingency. It's ironic, I feel, that Buddhism, as soon as it becomes a kind of a fixed conformity, orthodoxy, then basically it's transgressing some of the fundamental principles of the Dharma, that things are always changing, that things are never satisfactory. Buddhism too gets locked into the thing, well, we don't want this to change. This particular orthodoxy is entirely satisfactory. And so I think we have to return also to those core insights of the Dharma, that we live in a contingent, fluid, imperfect world, and whatever we generate will always be understood, always be constrained by impermanence, imperfection, contingency, chance, chaos, all those things. And what kind of Sangha will flourish in that highly contingent sense of our lives together in this world now? And I think we learn, there's this famous saying by, I think it was George Santayana, who said that those who do not learn the lessons of history are bound to repeat their mistakes. And I think we can learn a great deal from the lessons of Buddhist history. And in doing so, hopefully, try not to make the same mistakes again. That would be my take on it.
One of the things you and I definitely have in common is that as a sense of the importance of early Buddhism, the Buddhism of the Pali Canon, as recorded in the Pali Canon, for our sense of the Dharma.
Yeah.
You know, you could constantly refer back to the sayings attributed to the Buddha in the Pali Canon as like a touchstone for counts as the Dharma. And you, in your talk yesterday, you referred us a lot to that kind of your ongoing research into this. And I thought it'd be good to talk a bit about that, because we've got some slightly different point of view, and it might be interesting for people to hear two points of view. So what was particularly striking is that your account of the early Buddhist teachings is one in which you refuse the idea of a metaphysical truth. I mean, I realise I'm trying to summarise your point of view, which is a bit pointless, but I'm trying to head into that area, perhaps in order to come up with a different account. Maybe I should say what I think, and then you can.
Yes, I think you give your point of view, then I'll see. Let's see how I respond to that.
So even just then, when you were talking about the Dharma, you were pointing out that the world is fluid and ever-changing and impermanent. That means, of course, that it's pointless to try and establish a kind of Buddhism that is fixed in its institutions. So it occurs to me that this is exactly the early Buddhist metaphysics. It's a gesture towards the nature of reality. Fluid and changing, a kind of process. And yet, on the other hand, what strikes me is that this nature of reality, which the Buddha points us towards, is not one that we can satisfactorily form a concept of. We can't actually conceive it in an accurate form. So there's this. I'd say that early Buddhist metaphysics, their account of reality, is in one sense can be put into words through gestures of saying reality is impermanent, it's therefore lacks substantiality, and therefore it's unsatisfactory. And yet that reality is also, in another sense, beyond our ability to conceive it. There's a kind of inconceivability about the nature of things. And yet to have an insight into that nature of things is liberating. So my point of view, my understanding of early Buddhism is not to deny the idea that there's truth claims in early Buddhism, but rather to pinpoint them as very specific claim about the nature of truth.
Well, you see, I wouldn't. My problem is in many ways with this notion of the nature of truth, or the use of the word reality. I don't find real equivalence for that in the early texts, that particular concept. I find that let's say, the idea of impermanence, for example, I don't think of it as somehow a kind of a cipher or a clue into what is the actual nature of the way things really are. I think it is simply a very useful reminder. It's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb to always bear in mind the fact that things are likely to change. They may or they may not. But where I find it problematic is when you get a metaphysical statement like sabba sankhara anicca. All conditioned things are impermanent. That occurs in the Dhammapada. I'm not sure it really, well, it's implied elsewhere too, but as soon as you make that step into all conditioned things are impermanent, you're basically into dogma, metaphysics, and you're making claims that I don't really think you can ever substantiate. One example is I could bring I've often thought of doing this, I never have, bring a quartz crystal into the Dharma hall and say, okay, this is impermanent, right? What is telling you it's impermanent? A diamond, let's say. But a Buddhist will then feel constrained. Oh no, it must be impermanent because it's a conditioned thing. Therefore, at the end of when the sun goes into its heat death or whatever, then it will disappear. To me, that's suddenly you've jumped into a realm of abstraction. Impermanence is no longer something here that's helping you negotiate your relationship with the world. It's become something in which you've become invested in as true. I'm not convinced at all, and I see no need whatsoever to believe that all conditioned things are impermanent, all conditioned things are suffering, and and sabha dhamma anicca, anatta, all things are not self. I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's not. I don't find that. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, basically, because that's exactly what I think the Buddha was warning against when he warned against metaphysics. And you can't dispute that that's not a very, very, I think, central idea, that all of these questions about the beginning and the end of the universe, whether mind and body are same or different, even the idea of reincarnation, I think is built into that too, whether the Tathagata exists after death or not. It's all a waste of time. It's really not relevant. All that really matters is how am I encountering and responding to the situations in life that I find myself here and now. The only useful binary, I think, that the Buddha uses is between kusala, akusala, skillful, unskillful. It's ethical. Again and again and again. My worry about metaphysics is because it takes us away from the ethics. It somehow makes the establishment of truth a sine qua non, a necessary condition for being able to lead a good life. I don't think that's true. Samadhi, I understand really as almost a constant state of surprise and astonishment. The ability not to be locked into the binaries of is and is not, atta, ati, and nati. That's the middle way. The middle way is basically suspending any concern with affirming or denying the ontological status of states of affair in the world. I think it's entirely redundant. I think the Gautama in the suttas is largely consistent on this point, although of course there are passages in the suttas that give glimpses of other possibilities. But what strikes me as really, absolutely fundamental to Gautama's teaching is this refusal to get caught up and entangled within metaphysical claims and to somehow seek to affirm them or to deny them. But instead, to take the Dharma as really about a way of life, a principle of judgment, as Robert Ellis would put it, to negotiate my way through the world. So yes, certain rules of thumb are useful. It's useful to think about suffering, very, very useful, impermanence, but not to then take the next step and say that's the nature of reality. You don't have to do that. I don't think you gain anything by doing that at all. I think you actually then get involved in the kinds of quarrels and disputes that this is an example of Buddhism getting in the way of practicing the Dharma, basically.
Thanks. I think this is a great area. So I'm gonna pitch the other side of the point of view here. So you talked to some degree about this in your talk yesterday, so I was able to think about it, and it made me think of a discourse in the Middle Length Sayings called the Chanky Sutta.
Sorry, which one?
The Chanky Sutta.
The Chanky Sutta. Oh, I may not remind me. What is the Chanky Sutta?
So the Chanky Sutta opens with the Buddha in conversation with an arrogant Brahmin. Arrogant Brahmin who believes he's got the truth. as the Brahmins are kind of the one of the fall guys in the Pali Canon. They tend to make claims that they know what's true, and the Buddha's not worth bowing down to or honouring because he doesn't have this ancient truth. But Gautama takes Chanky to task, of course, and tries to get Chanky to explain the basis of his claims that he knows the truth. And of course, they're all based on tradition, which he has no independent access to. So it ends up being that. And then the Buddha leads Chanky through a kind of a series of steps of thought about how does he know the truth. And he asks, he answers the question of how there's the preservation of the truth and how there's the discovery of truth. And this discovery of truth comes, of course, through practicing the Dharma that you learn from someone who actually understands it, which is to say, the Buddha. And there's a full realization of the truth of Satya. So, of course, we don't need to take this to be a metaphysical claim like the claims of the Brahmins, which are, of course, kind of intellectual or traditional claims. But it does seem to suggest that the Buddha's teaching does relate to the nature of reality as the Buddha realized it, which is to say impermanent and insubstantial and so on. But the very means to realize that is through letting go of holding on to speculative views. So I'd say this critique of metaphysics that you're quite rightly drawing attention to be the Buddhist contribution to metaphysics. The speculative views can never furnish us with the truth. And yet there is a truth which becomes available as one lets go of that whole way of looking for it, which seeks a kind of certainty through the use of reason and tradition alone.
Well, maybe. I just don't think that way anymore. I can't see what one gains by believing that there is a truth, that there is a reality. And what do you gain from that, Dhivan? That if you didn't believe that, would you live differently? I'm talking about beliefs. You know, you're just saying this is the nature of reality. I'm saying I don't know what the nature of reality is. I don't think it's within our capacity as human beings to know what the nature of reality is. It's a fundamental mystery. It's absolutely mind-blowingly weird, the situation within. I don't want to lock that down in categories like impermanence and dependency and suffering and pure mind or whatever. I think that does an injustice to the mystery of life. The problem with any claim to truth, any claim to reality, is that you risk compromising the sheer awe and wonder of being alive at all, of being in this world at all. You see, I just go back on my own little history here. I spent a number of years in one of the most metaphysical traditions of Buddhism you can imagine, the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. And we really got reality down to an absolute precise description in all manner. And I just got sick of all of that. I just found it was taking me actually out of my body. I really felt that I was actually losing it. I was getting destabilized. And that's what drove me off into a Zen monastery, where for 4 years, the only meditation I did was to ask the question, what is this? What is this? And that was a profoundly important practice for me to do. It's still basically the practice that animates my life as a Dharma practitioner. What is this? To hold the question. And in holding the question, you're not just holding some intellectual curiosity, you're actually opening your heart and your soul to the sheer wonder of being alive at all. And my worry is that any metaphysical claim is going to foreclose that capacity to wonder, that capacity to be astonished and perplexed and bewildered and awed by reality. And that, I think, is the great contribution of the Chan tradition. But I don't think it was doing anything new. I think it was actually going back very much to the Buddha's idea of samadhi, dreadfully translated as right view. Something like true vision, let's put it something like that. Which I think, when you think of being in a middle way between being and non-being, that is just a rather abstract way of describing what it's like to ask a question. If I ask a question of where is Paris, that means I don't know where Paris is. I can't say it's here, I can't say it's there, whether it exists, doesn't exist. That samadhi is about holding reality as a question. And that's, to me, more primordial and fundamental for me as a spiritual being than believing whether things are impermanent or suffering or anatta or whatever. Those ideas are, again, useful heuristics. They help guide us along the path, but that's all they're really there for. They're not there to be proven or disproven, because then we get wound up back into views and opinions, or what you call speculative views. And I think a lot of Buddhism is full of those sort of speculative views, and different traditions are very, very concerned to hold on to them and to defend them. But that's the Dharma wars I've given up. I don't give a toss about that stuff anymore.
That's just going back to, I'd like to make a distinction, though, based on what you just said, that it might come, one might hear what you said and think that if one believes in metaphysics, that in some way means one's not able to appreciate the mystery of life, or be in awe of it. This must be untrue, because we can think of Plato or Aristotle, who made the, I'm sure we should believe them when they say that philosophy begins in wonder. And yet Plato and Aristotle were tremendous metaphysicians, developed very sophisticated, interesting metaphysics. So I wouldn't necessarily say that holding to, having a sense of the nature of reality, for instance, meant that it was impossible to emotionally rest in, or not rest, be amazed at life. And going on from that, if I can share a sort of different perspective, it would be that I can hear your skepticism, if you see what I mean, your philosophical skepticism. I can read it. I can read your rejoicing in Montaigne, his skepticism. But for me, I feel personally, I suppose, that skepticism tends to tends to lead me towards a kind of postmodern kind of point of view, which I see around me amongst my friends and associates. People who basically have rejected the idea that there's any sort of nature of reality. What we're left with is just this experience, which is a kind of relative phenomenon without any possibility of establishing kind of meaning or any sort of glimpse of transcendence. And so for me, skepticism, emotionally at least, risks a kind of caving into certain, to an aspect of modernity, as it were, which is this lack of a sort of guiding sense of what the cosmos is like and what possibilities life might have. And I find that the Buddhist, let's call it a vision of reality, of constantly in process, and yet full of the potential for awakening, gives me a kind of compass, something to trust. As it were. So I'm maybe that is a personal preference for metaphysics.
When you said compass, I thought you said comfort. It gives me a certain sense of comfort.
Compass,
I like the idea of compass. And this is, again, I think that's what we should think of as impermanence and all of these things. I like, they're compasses. They help us give a certain direction. But frankly, if I want to think about the nature of reality, I don't look to Buddhism, I look to science. The thing that really, really blows me away is, and I'm not scientifically wired or trained at all, but the way in which biology has revealed the way in which life has evolved, the way in which astrophysics and cosmology display to us the incredible extent of the universe. I'm willing to call that reality if need be, but it's so extraordinarily weird and overwhelming and beautiful, and awe-inspiring, and that all words fail. I mean, I don't, to call it reality doesn't really just do much for me there. And but once again, you see, I don't really see really what's gained by adhering to notions of truth and reality. I am a skeptic, I admit that, and I know there are dangers in skepticism. People say you don't really have any deep values and so forth. You see, the real issue, both in Christianity and in Buddhism, is the notion that somehow ethics is tied to truth. In other words, and this is again very much Plato, Aristotle. In other words, the good and the true are somehow the same. This is, I think, Socrates would have thought that. And this, I feel, is possibly where the Buddha is parting company with that kind of view. I don't think he said, I honestly don't feel that's really the core of his message. That you can have the good without it being founded on something that you can then secure as the true. I don't think that's necessary. I think you can have an ethics of uncertainty, which is the name of the book I'm writing at the moment as a pre-plug. This is what coronavirus lockdown has led me to write a book about the ethics of uncertainty. In other words, an ethics that is founded on skepticism. And I think the key to it lies basically in having the courage to risk letting go of ontology. In other words, letting go altogether of questions of what is, and turn instead to questions of what suffers. To me, instead of ontos, we want pathos. Instead of ontology, we want a new kind of pathology, weirdly. Sounds odd. But I think you can found your ethics entirely upon your experience as an emotional, spiritual, sensitive, thinking person to the suffering of oneself and others and the world and the environment and the biosphere and everything. That my passion really is to try to articulate a Dharma that is founded entirely upon a response to dukkha, without having any need to ground that response on some conviction of what is true. I think it's unnecessary. And likewise, I'd suggest by dropping some of your ideas about truth and reality might help you open up even more fundamentally to the mystery of life, and to be able to just sit in a state of not knowing, which is again the flip side of what is this, is I don't know. And I feel that that's something particularly in modernity. I think people are intoxicated by their sense of knowledge, of knowing. And I think our scientific world, our education systems are all in a sense driven towards this is true, this is the nature of reality. And there may be some value in that at some level, to free ourselves from superstition, to free ourselves from, distortions and so forth. Of course, that's necessary. Particularly for practical purposes. But the trouble is it reinforces this habit of mind that is so concerned with having the truth. And that, I think, can very easily get in the way of responding to suffering, which is far more, to me, the urgent challenge that faces us as living beings in this world today.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'll be looking forward to that book. Although, in a way, the Buddha is well known for saying he teaches dukkha and the end of dukkha. So it would be quite what you just said is in a way a straightforward interpretation of early Buddhism.
Well, except I actually don't believe he said that. My sense is that he said, I teach dukkha and the ending of Tangha. If you read After Buddhism, I've got a long, complicated argument about that. The Nibbana is really the ending of Tangha. It's the ending of grasping. It's the ending of confusion. It's the ending of these things. This ending of suffering business is too much locked into traditional Indian soteriology. Whether or not the Buddha was interested in the ending of suffering, I honestly don't know. But the key thing from a practical point of view is to somehow free yourself from the entanglements of grasping and craving and reactivity and so forth and so on, because that's what prevents you from responding to suffering. We don't have time now to go into, into that perhaps much further, but to me that is very, very important. And one metaphysical belief that I think Buddhism, that I really cannot accept in Buddhism, is that craving is the cause of suffering. Ignorance is the cause of suffering. Of course, in specific moments, yes, that's true. But again, that is a very classic metaphysical claim that suffering, in other words, all of life, the panchakanda, everything, is the result of craving and ignorance. That's what Buddhist dogma tells you. And that to me is completely unacceptable. It's no different from saying, the universe is created by God. Exactly the same. And yet that's very, very central to Buddhist metaphysics. And in that sense, I'm not a Buddhist at all. I can't believe that. Okay. I think that was a very crucial turn in the wrong direction to adopt that dogma.
Okay, so on this topic, I was also thinking about truth. So this leads us to dependent arising a bit, because the topic of tanha, craving, and ignorance, avidya, these are fundamental kind of elements of the 12 nidanas, which is the content of the Buddha's teaching of dependent arising. So I thought I'd read out a little bit from the discourse on dependent arising. It's this is like a Sanskrit version of a well-known Pali text. Whether or not there is the arising of Tathagatas, realized ones, this natural principle for the maintenance of the way experience works, of the Dhamma, is quite firm. The realized one, having himself completely understood it and awakened to it, declares it, and so on. And the next bit, therefore, the natural stability of the way experience works, the natural lawfulness of the way experience works, the coordinated nature of how experience works, lacking untruth, not being otherwise, as is the case in truth, in reality, in a coordinated way, unequivocally, undistortedly, as specific conditionality, this natural course of dependent arising. This is called dependent arising. So you couldn't get much more of a clear statement about the nature of reality from the Buddha as that. It's an Anguttara passage, right? I think that one.
Well,
the Pali version's in the Nidana Samyutta of the Samyutta.
It's the Samyutta, yeah. I'm familiar with that text, and it strikes me as probably later, which is convenient for me to say, of course. But of course, you'll find passages like that. But to me, the interesting question is, why are you attracted to that passage? Why can you? What is it that holds your attention on that passage? That you have it to hand, you know about it. What is it giving you? Why are you drawn to that passage rather than passages elsewhere that are not making those kinds of grandiose claims?
I suppose I'm drawn to this part. I thought of it because it quite clearly puts into words a kind of early Buddhist perspective on truth and reality, that dependent arising is objective. It's not just the Buddha's teaching, it's an objective feature of things. So I thought that would be an interesting point to bring up. For me personally, I find this interesting because it's the basis of a Buddhist philosophy, as it were, which includes, as it were, some claims about the nature of reality. And from a psychological point of view, this account of dependent arising gives us something to chew on. The 12 nidanas, thinking of them as somehow not just the Buddha's teaching, but the nature of how experience works in an objective way. For me, at least, makes me think, oh gosh, that's quite a strong teaching from the Buddha. That's really something to investigate. And I find it very worthwhile to investigate these teachings in my experience.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, of course, we're all going to follow our own noses here, and we're going to be drawn to things. So I do think we do need occasionally to say, why am I drawn to that? Now, for example, the 12 nidanas, I think, is almost certainly a doctrine that evolved over time and is now sort of slotted in as the kind of the orthodox view that obviously was, came up within the canonical, probably either during or shortly after the Buddha's lifetime, I suspect. But we also know that there are shorter versions of the 12 links. There's 3 suttas which have 10 links, in which ignorance and karma are out, which is interesting. And we have a passage in the Atthakavagga in which there are only 6 or 7 links. And that's the one that I think is more original. Because generally speaking, I think you'd probably agree, that over the course of time, religious doctrines don't get shorter, they get longer. Yeah. I think that's probably the case. The 12-link model is the one that a certain body of monks presumably decided, this is the official version. We slot that in wherever we can find it. This is the nature of reality. Fair enough. I mean, maybe they're right. I have no idea. But looking at the text from a sort of historical critical perspective, I would put my attention initially on the version in the Atthakavagga. And the one in the Atthakavagga doesn't make any claims about how we got to be born or what is the origin of suffering. It has to do just with, basically, it's an analysis of human conflict. The Buddha says, why do people get into quarrels and disputes? And then he starts, I think, with papancha, and then it works up to contact, feeling, craving. In other words, the middle section of the 12 links, that's the important bit. The rest, I think, is metaphysics. I don't think the central section is. From Nama-rupa Vijnana, Salayatana, the 6 senses, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, that to me is an absolutely testable, is that the right word? Yeah, that's something you can test out for yourself. Yeah. You don't need to believe that there were previous lives or ignorance in the background or whatever. Put all that aside, and you find at the core of the 12 links about 6 that are to do with this life, are to do with something you can empirically observe for yourself, and crucially, they are the links that can actually transform your state of mind from one that is caught up in needless reactivity to one that has come to rest, has come to calm, to come to clarity, from which you can then respond to the dukkha of the situation at hand. So if we look at it pragmatically, which I would look at it, I'm pragmatic, I'm skeptic, I'm agnostic, all of those things. There I feel we find a way of considering the nidanas in a way that we don't need any claims to this is the nature of reality. It's not necessary. I think it gets in the way, frankly. I've given up on that. Should we bring some of the other people in? We only have 20 minutes left.
Over to you, Tom.
Thank you. And of course, people can now put any questions they like, and I'll try and facilitate that. Dhivan, I've just had a request from Kamala Nandi on the streaming on Facebook. If you might be able to pin or put it on speaker mode from now, I think that would probably help with the Facebook feed, if that's possible. But I think I'm going to abuse my position as facilitator in the first instance, and then we'll take Wendy's question, which has just come through, and one of them. But I was very interested to hear about your views on metaphysics, obviously, and it seems to me that this discussion could have been had maybe 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece, and it wouldn't have gone that differently. In fact, there would have been, you know, positions that were recognizable in both of your camps. So I'm curious about that. I wonder whether it's because we're Westerners or because we're philosophers or neither. And to sort of slightly extend that a bit, whether it's, I know, Dhivan, you've written a lot about classical philosophy, and Stephen, you've been very interested in existentialism for some time in some of your books. So if you might just sort of talk a bit about your relationships to Western philosophy, I'd be very interested. Oh, you're on mute, Stephen.
Okay. I don't know if this is directed to me or to Dhivan or both of us. Should we both say a few words?
That'd be great.
As Dhivan knows, I'm particularly interested at the moment in Hellenistic philosophy and Greek philosophy, ancient philosophy. And I think there are strong resonances, particularly actually with Greek skepticism of Pyrrho and some of the early texts we find in the Pali Suttas, particularly in the Atthakavagga and the Sutta Nipata. I think both are advocating forms of skepticism. And I feel that there was a meeting, a common thought world occurring in the ancient world. We know that Pyrrho did in fact go to India with Alexander. He studied with so-called gymnosophists, naked sages, that may have included Buddhist monks, we don't know. But nonetheless, I do feel that a great deal can be gained from trying to find points of commonality with the ancient Greek philosophers, particularly those who practiced philosophy. This is one of the things that we tend to forget today, that the Hellenistics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, for them philosophy wasn't just an academic discipline, it was a way of life. It was how you live. It was how you cure the soul. The teacher, the philosopher is compared to a doctor, just as the Buddha is compared to a doctor. And I think there are some extraordinarily vital points of connection here that both Buddhists and Western thinkers would do, I think could benefit from knowing more about. So that's where my current interest in philosophy is. And I agree, I think the questions that Dhivan and I have been discussing were questions of the ancient world. I mean, the Greeks, you know, they have their skeptics, and then they have Aristotle, and they have people with, you know, great claims to certainty. The early Buddhists too. It wasn't just one view that these people had, but there were lots of different schools. I mean, they say traditionally 18 different schools emerged shortly after the Buddha. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of interaction going on. And I think we have to step back and acknowledge that what really matters is the interaction, is the debate, is the discussion, is the disagreement, is the tension, not Buddhism has got the right answer. Buddhism has somehow nailed truth. Then you end up in this sort of oppositional kind of debate, which I don't think is always very helpful. Dhivan, what do you say about that?
Well, I was just going to say that, yes, I was at your college weekend in which yourself and John Peacock were laying out some of these connections and differences between Hellenistic philosophy and Buddhism, and I really appreciated that. I've also been looking into, I really love Tom's point that we could have been having this. And I completely agree. My own research is into Hellenistic philosophy and Buddhism have been heading towards the idea that it's important not to try and link up Buddhism too closely with any of the Hellenistic philosophies. So I'd resist the idea that we can completely understand Buddhism by comparing it with skepticism, for instance. Now, clearly, we couldn't link Buddhism too closely with Platonism or Aristotelianism, and it shares some features with Epicureanism and Stoicism. But I'd suggest that something like your own interest in skepticism might lead you to see the skeptical side of Buddhism. But I'd like to emphasize how Buddhism is a different tradition, and the emphasis in the Buddhist tradition on a intuitive insight into
reality.
You got it. into something that's liberating. Actually sets it apart from the Hellenistic schools. That would be my addition to this, as you say, this dialogue. Thanks very much. Over to
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Tom, what's the next question?
Thank you both. So Natalia's asked, Stephen, in your talk yesterday, you spoke about the need for a secular Buddhism. And today you have talked about, you've advocated skepticism in relation to notions of truth. What would be in the place of devotion within this view?
We touched on devotion yesterday, didn't we? We touched on ritual yesterday. Didn't we? Or is that another conversation?
Yeah.
Well, again, you see, I think we use words like ritual and devotion in a way that we probably understand quite intuitively. But when you ask a question like, what is the role of devotion in secular Buddhism? I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, well, A, what is secular Buddhism? And B, what do I actually mean by devotion? We don't have time to go into all that now. All I can offer as an answer is my own experience of devotion. To me, the greatest act of devotion is to sit cross-legged on the floor and watch my breath and just be present with as little interference as possible, keeping an open mind, keeping this question, what is this, or whatever. Or that to me is an act of devotion. I'm putting aside my other concerns, and I'm focusing on what fundamentally matters for me as a human person. In other words, to be able to encounter this life that I find myself in and respond to it in a way that might enable myself and others to benefit, to flourish in some way. And I think that is an opening of the heart, which is devotional. My meditation practice is not an intellectual exercise at all. It's heartfelt, it's embodied, and it's a suspension of basically views and opinions. And that to me is a form of prayer, if you like. I mean, prayer, the word doesn't work for me, but contemplative prayer is very similar to that. And I keep coming really back to this in my own practice and in my teaching, is the centrality of allowing ourselves to be more questioning and to integrate that dimension into our practice. So that to me is what it means to practice devotion. And whether you are a secular Buddhist or a religious Buddhist, it doesn't really matter. I think all human beings at one level can probably appreciate that quality of their lives.
Thank you. Wendy's asked, I'd be interested in Stephen's view of the Kalama Sutta, which seems to argue that the method for discovering what's true is to test it in experience and see if it leads to wholesomeness.
Yeah.
Is this not a clear link between truth and ethics?
No, not at all. No, on the contrary. I think the whole point of the Kalama Sutta is about, I like the Kalama Sutta. It's one of my key texts. I think for any self-respecting Buddhist modernist, you'll find the Kalama Sutta somewhere in their library and somewhere in their thinking. Yeah, it's basically saying, don't just trust tradition and reason and all of these things, but test things out for yourself. And what matters in the end is ethics. What matters is, and again, I can't stand this translation, wholesome, unwholesome, skillful, unskillful. In other words, the real challenge of this Dharma practice is to actually refine one's moral compass in terms of your skillful, are you responding to this situation skillfully, unskillfully? And I think the only measure for that is in terms of suffering. Are you alleviating suffering, yourself and others? Are you contributing to it? I don't think truth comes into this whatsoever. What comes into it is, does it work? And if you look at the conclusion of the Kalama Sutta, or not quite the conclusion, the Buddha says, whether there is a future life or not, whether there is a working out a karmic law or not, if you follow this ethical practice, and I think he's presenting very clearly an ethical practice, that will bring you fulfillment and well-being in this world, here and now. He's completely open as to the metaphysical frame within which you lead your ethical life. It's a good example, in fact, I would say, of an ethics that is not, in a sense, rooted in metaphysics.
Could I add?
Dhivan, please add something to that.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, but I'd like to add some other comments, which is that
Mm-hmm.
the context for the Kalama Sutta is that the Kalamas have they've lost trust in the various spiritual teachers who come to speak to them because they all disagree and argue.
Mm-hmm.
So the Buddha deliberately presents a form of teaching which they can test out for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's such a skillful way of teaching. But and he introduces them to the practice of metta bhavana and the other Triratna Order, which is obviously part of his own training program. But it could be that the end result of them practicing could be that they go for refuge to the Buddha.
Yeah, sure.
And in that sense, they do turn to the truth as the Buddha taught it, perhaps provisionally in the spirit he put it. And in which case their sense of ethics would then have led them to a further interest in the nature of the truth, as the Buddha puts it.
Okay, next question.
So, Barry,
I missed you there, Tom. You went ping.
Some of the caveats that you made about this. I'm going to introduce a question from Sean. Can both the skeptical view and the metaphysical view work with a provisional truth? Is Dharma truth provisional truth? Scientific truth is provisional truth too. It's what we know that is open to amendment if new evidence is presented.
Yeah, I have no problems with provisional
Maybe something
truth.
on provisional truth, relative and absolute truth.
If we're going to have to talk about truth in this way, then provisional truth works a lot better. But I actually prefer looking at it epistemologically and talk of justified beliefs. I think that's a useful way to look at it. I think certain beliefs are much more justifiable than others. That doesn't mean that, that is the truth. But given what we can know with our limited knowledge in the point at which our culture and our science has developed to this point, this is probably the most reliable thing to base ourselves on. Again, we find this in the suttas. There's a very famous passage where the Buddha says that what the wise in the world agree upon as existent, I agree upon as existing. What the wise in the world do not agree upon as existing, or agree upon as not existing, I too say that does not exist. Now, this passage, again, points to the fact that the Buddha is not actually making primarily truth claims. He's acknowledging that he goes along with what the current expertise in these different fields might be. In other words, he accepts these findings as justified bases for belief, but he doesn't claim that this is the truth. So I would, provisional truth, but justified beliefs, I find is more helpful because it avoids having to deal with that word truth.
Okay, thank you. Slightly different tack. Vardika has asked, do you think that your presentation of the Dharma is for people that are already familiar with it? And do you think your teachings are accessible to beginners to the Dharma? If not, have you thought how you might go about putting together a beginner's view of the Dharma itself?
Well, I struggle with this, I must admit. Obviously, a lot of what I'm saying is going to make sense to people who've been asking the same kinds of questions and reading the same sort of books and studying the same stuff. But I've also found recently, particularly when I've been working with people from the mindfulness community, that actually not knowing about Buddhism is actually an advantage. Because I spend a lot of time basically trying to argue people out of their Buddhist opinions. As with Dhivan, for example, I mean, we don't agree on this. And so we get into this discussion. It's a useful discussion. In many ways, the community of practitioners that is now approaching the Dharma from the background of mindfulness practice is that they're coming to the teachings really from a transformative experience they've already had. They know that this meditation is working and they want to know more about it, how it works. And yet they don't come preloaded with lots of Buddhist baggage. And I feel more and more that my audience is people like that, rather than Buddhists, jaded or devout or whatever. Because once again, I think the way I'm presenting the Dharma, I think it jars too much with certain Buddhist orthodox beliefs, the Four Noble Truths, the 12 Links, the law of karma. I just don't have any time for that. So in some ways, I prefer students who don't know anything about Buddhism. So we kind of can start from scratch, rather than first of all get into this endless argument about whether my interpretation of Buddhism is correct or not.
Thank you. Angie's just come in here with, do you think that mindfulness has been disassociated from the ethics of Buddhism and so has been used for erroneous ends?
Is this to me or to Dhivan or to both of us?
I think that's to you, Stephen.
Yes, of course it has. I mean, mindfulness has been co-opted into all kinds of crazy things, you know, hunting deer and so on. So, but given the fact that we are a capitalist consumerist society, how could it be otherwise? Of course, these things are going to get appropriated by all manner of interest groups or try to turn it into their own thing. That's true. But I also feel that on the whole, the introduction of mindfulness into the wider society, I feel to be a very positive thing. And I evaluate that not so much in terms of scholarly studies, but in terms of the people who come on the retreats I lead and the courses I give and the talks I give, many of whom now are coming not from Buddhism or even from an interest in Buddhism, but because of this practice they've had that has really made a positive difference in their lives. And I think by positive difference is that in practicing mindfulness, people open up a space within themselves in which they can allow the real questions of their life to come to the surface. You open up a non-reactive space in which you just notice what's going on rather than get carried away by it. That's the basic strategy in all these mindfulness interventions. But that opens up a space of vulnerability, a space of honesty, a space of freedom, within which deeper questions can then be posed. And that, I feel, is becoming an increasingly wide source for people to then approach the Dharma as a philosophy and as an ethics. But I've yet to be, you know, people say that, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. We're running out of time. And my iPad is running out of battery power.
Okay, thank you so much for that fulsome set of question and answers there at the end as well. Dhivan, would you like to summarize and lead us out?
Oh, that's quite a thing to ask me to do.
It's a hospital pass, I think that's what they call it.
A what, sorry?
A hospital pass, it's a thing in rugby.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a few more questions, but really, I suppose to summarize our discussion, we've been able to kind of meet through this tremendous Zoom platform instead of being in the Dharma parlor, a great big marquee in a field in Somerset. And I really hope, Stephen, that next year or at some point you will be able to join us and get the smells, the sounds, the feel of that particular community. And we've talked about different kinds of Buddhist approaches to Buddhism in the modern world. The word pluralism and diversity has come up quite a lot as we've been talking. And Stephen, of course, is fantastically well able to express a certain his approach to understanding the Dharma, which I've personally felt inspired by. And I really welcome the fact that you've been willing to get into a disagreement in this kind of public kind of, well, not public, but online venue. That to me, I think it speaks to my heart about the value of dialogue and the kind of the importance of openness to and friendship in the Sangha, as well as being true to our deeply held I was going to say views, but I more mean our ways of engaging with what's most important to us. So I'd like to say,
good, thank you.
Big thank you for joining us in this this festival.
Well, I'd also like to conclude by thanking you very much indeed for having invited me. And I wish I had had the chance to be in the field as such, rather than the virtual field. But on the other hand, this has allowed me to have a weekend in Paris, which is where I am right now. I'm in a hotel in Paris. It's my brother's birthday. I'm here with my wife, and he's with his wife, and we're going to the Louvre tomorrow, which you go in on a, you have to get a time slot and you distance yourself. But there's no millions of tourists, no Americans, no Chinese. It's great. So please keep well. Thank you so much, and have a good life. And thank you so much, Dhivan, for being my interlocutor.
Yes. And thank you, Tom, for hosting.
Thank you, Tom, too. Okay, I'm going to sign out. So bye-bye.